This is my now third week and week number 3, day 2 after my surgery. Okay, we're going to quit this. Okay, this is Jay back again. This is my third week and second day after my surgery. And one thing I would like people to pray about is my job situation. I am a teacher. The next month is going to be very difficult because I have a lot of doctor's appointments, have to go in for biopsies and so on. But there's a good chance that starting in 1 or 2 weeks I can do remote learning. We did that last semester, and basically the students, they received assignments online, they did them at home, turned them in, I graded them, I corresponded by email. This year, they're going to do something a little bit different with some of the students. It's called Launch Ed in Orlando. And basically, we'll actually have live classes. So I would be on video like this, giving a lesson, then I would give them the assignments and so on. And I talked to my principal, and he's brand new principal and got hit with all this COVID stuff. And we had quite a lengthy conversation yesterday about what to do. Basically, they're going to try to make an accommodation for me to be in. There are several teachers that are going to be teaching from home. I feel that I should be at the top of the list. So I have to do a lot of things with, I have to apply for disability in order to be able to do that and so on. So just pray for that process, that it goes smoothly and that God makes a way. So far, everything has been miraculous the way it's gone on. And other than that, the third biopsy came back 0.0 negative, which is good news. And just pray that my body adjusts to the meds, that there's no complications with the anti-rejection immune suppressant drugs I'm taking. Okay. Last week we talked about Pat McEwen, who is a friend of mine. She went on to be with the Lord last fall. She was a missionary to the nations. And this week I want to talk about Jeff Ziegler. All right. I title this tribute Onward, Christian Soldier. And that's a hymn by Martin Luther. Jeff was a Lutheran growing up and then became a very radical Christian in his college years. And then later went on to found several ministries and was involved with church networks and had a huge impact in my life. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about growing up. I was raised Roman Catholic, come from a Roman Catholic family. We always had a Bible in the house, and my cousin Keith and I were really interested in the Bible as teenagers. Like I had read the New Testament through a couple of times, read the Bible. I was more of a Catholic, I think, than he was. Like I, attended services. I went to CCD classes, and we read the Bible. We actually had in our high school a Bible as literature class that went for a whole year, Old Testament and the New Testament. So I knew the Bible pretty much front and back. Read most of the books, or surveyed most of the books. And then when I was in college, my cousin Keith became part of an Assemblies of God church. And that was his conversion to Christ. And then I came a few years later, and we were attending this church in Boston called the Boston Worship Center, and met a lot of really good people, a lot of young people, a lot of college-age students, yuppies. And then what was really cool was we met in the North End. Like we met, if you know where the North End is in Boston, there's Hanover Street, where they have the Paul Revere statue and the Old North Church, and then Paul Revere's church opposite of that. And if you go over like 2 blocks, there's a street called Salutation Street. And there was a little storefront there. It was called the, not storefront, but a little building, tiny little building. And it was called the Children's Haven. The Children's Haven was founded by Ann Kimmel Anderson, who was a very popular author. She had a mission to the children in the inner city in Boston. And that was kind of interesting. So she in her lease, or in her, whatever it was, the sales agreement that she left when she died, she said the building could be only sold to a ministry that had a ministry to children. So that became the Boston Worship Center. So our church bought it, moved in. What's really cool about the Boston Worship Center is if you go down the street to State Street, at the corner of State Street and Salutation Street, used to be in the 1700s a little tavern, and it was called the Salutation Tavern. And that's where Paul Revere and John Hancock and other people met, Samuel Adams. They met and they planned the revolution. So it's kind of cool to be like right in the center of like the revolution was planned over here across the street from us, around the corner where the lanterns were hung. So there's a lot of spiritual significance about being there. Our pastor, Greg Detweiler, brought in this itinerant minister called Jeff Ziegler. I believe it was in 1986. And he got up and he preached on revival and revival history and revival theology. Now, my cousin Keith and I had started this newsletter in our church. It was called the Holiness Herald. And Keith was a really good artist. I could write, Keith could write. And we would write articles. And, we saw ourselves as being very radical, kind of like Keith Green's newsletter, Last Days newsletter. We had holiness unto the Lord, no compromise, And we put like little warning labels on the newsletter, if you are carnal and cold at heart and you read this, you might be offended. However, if you love God with all your heart, this might start a fire and change, We had these crazy kind of stuff on the newsletter. And we were into reading things like when I was first converted, I went over to my cousin's house. I would sleep over there quite a lot. And he had me reading things like, St. Augustine, different memoirs of revival figures like George Whitefield and Wesley. I had known Jonathan Edwards. So instead of reading like the modern evangelical authors, we started reading like the classics, the people, especially people that were involved with revival, D.L. Moody, Charles Finney, that type of thing. So Jeff came along and preached on all this, and we were like, wow, here's a kindred spirit, and he had a newsletter called The Revival Flame, very similar to ours, kind of, same idea, just printed on sheets of paper, stapled together. And one of the things that Jeff often preached on was talked about the militant church and the triumphant church. Okay, so we call the whole church together, all believers in all the world, is the Catholic Church, it's Church Universal. So all Christians believe that we're all part of one church. And there's only two divisions in the church. There's the Church Militant and the Church Triumphant. Okay? The Church Militant are all those Christians living on earth. They're Christians. They're basically a Christian militia. That's what Jeff called it. We're the Christian militia. We struggle against sin, the flesh, the devil, and the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's from Ephesians 6:12. Then there's the Church Triumphant. And these are those Christians who are in heaven. All right, so we have progressive sanctification that takes place through the struggle on earth. Everyone has to struggle on this earth. And then those who pass on to be present with the Lord are made perfect in a twinkling of an eye. That's 1 Corinthians 15:52. And so as much as anyone that I've ever known, Jeff Ziegler was a man who understood the meaning of the word church militant. All right. Now, unfortunately, on Tuesday, February 28th, 2012, Jeff left us. But the good news is he became part of the Church Triumphant. And so, many of us have lost family members that were Christians, and you can know that they were relieved of all their earthly struggle, and now they're made perfect in Christ. So we can be glad about that. An interesting story about me is that I had a summer miracle recently with I was in very tough shape with my heart. Received a heart transplant. There's a whole miraculous story behind that. Not a regenerative miracle, but it was a miracle of circumstances, if you follow my story. Jeff had something very similar happen to him in 2009. He suffered a cerebellar aneurysm, and he recovered from it. He actually died on the operating table. Heart started beating while the doctors were operating on him. They went to kind of, I don't know exactly what happened. I don't know the whole medical history, but basically he came back to life. His heart started beating again. And then the doctor said, this is 97% of the cases where you have a cerebellar aneurysm, there's certain death. And he came back. He was sitting up in bed the next couple of days. They said that, he might be in a coma. He might have had a stroke. We don't know what happened to him. So the doctors called his recovery. It was late December of 2009. This was a Christmas miracle. So I had my summer miracle. Jeff had his Christmas miracle. So I like that. And I just remembered that today. So I wanted to talk about that. Now, unfortunately, 2.5 years later, he had a heart attack. He was doing work at the Ohio State House, and they say it was unrelated to the earlier episode. So, God's very mysterious. He has his perfect plan, and I'm happy to say that Jeff, I'll see you someday in heaven. When Jeff and I first met, he was a speaker in our church, as I told you, in Boston Worship Center, 1987 actually, not 1985. We took him, Chris Tedford, my cousin Keith, Pastor Greg Detweiler, Jeff, and myself. We took a group on a revival tour of northern New England. And Jeff's hero was George Whitefield. So we went to all the churches where George Whitefield preached, and his home church. And my friend Chris knew all the sites. He was a Gordon Conwell graduate, and he was up in that area. I later moved to that area for a year to teach. And it's really interesting. You go around and you can see where these churches of the Great Awakening were. Later on, Jeff traveled to England and Scotland, and he was able to preach in one of the pulpits that was frequented by George Whitefield. So I knew him for 25 years. When I was writing the Holiness Herald, I would send copies out of the Holiness Herald to different people. And the only other magazine that I really admired, Christian magazine, was The Forerunner, which was Maranatha's magazine. By that time, I joined Maranatha Church in Boston. And one day I got a letter from Lee Grady, who is the editor of The Forerunner, saying, "Have you ever thought of joining our staff?" And I was teaching at the time in Beverly, Mass, and I was just like, it was an amazing coincidence that, this was my dream, was to write for a Christian publication full time. And just out of the blue, he offered me a position. So ever since then, I've been doing The Forerunner in some cases. So we were fortunate because I knew Jeff, and he had this vision for revival and reformation. So later on, he became a contributing editor. We took all of his articles on revival and reformation. They're all on the website now. I'll give you the links in a few minutes after I do the video. I'll put all the links down the bottom to all his articles. But he had a whole treasure of articles. We had articles from the Holiness Herald. So it was kind of easy to continue on with the Forerunner because we had all this back material that I could edit and go on. Jeff and I both have been through kind of a theological evolution in our lifetime. He started off as Lutheran, I started off as Catholic. We were part of like the Pentecostal charismatic movement, and then now kind of went toward Reformed, but not real extreme, truly Reformed, or what they call terribly Reformed. We both believe that if you take the vibrancy and the fervor of the charismatic movement and you marry it to sound Reformed orthodoxy, you have something very powerful. Okay? And it's very hard to describe this man, but if you know Jeff, he was always Jeff. Even though he changed a lot of what he thought theologically, he always was the same guy. And I would say that toward the end of his life, he became a lot more open to Lutheranism again. Like he started to come back to what Lutheranism said, and even he told me to Roman Catholicism. He says there's a lot of things in Roman Catholicism that actually are good, and we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So that's kind of like how I've ended up too. So it's interesting that we both kind of have gone on the same kind of a journey together. So back in the early 1990s, when I came to Florida, Jeff would contribute articles. And we had these phone calls. Sometimes our phone calls would go on for hours, for over an hour. And we covered every topic imaginable on the phone. So he had a huge impact on my thinking as a young Christian. I was involved in full-time missionary work and evangelistic work. And he would preach, and he would use my work in Russia as an example of, the post-millennial optimism and things like that. So I saw him whenever he came to Florida. I visited Cleveland for 2 conferences he organized. This man was always very gracious, but very direct when he needed to be. Like when he saw me saying something or writing something he didn't agree with, he would say, "Hey, what about this?" And one time he made sent me a tape and kind of preached to me about where he thought I'd gone off a little bit. So he used to call me when I was doing print version of the Forerunner. "Hey, let me give you some names of some donors that were very generous with me." And he would actually give me names of people that were donors. So he did that with without me asking him. He was just trying to help me. He also took a role in leading several organizations throughout Ohio for direct action, reforming culture and politics, pro-life activism, anti-pornography. One of the members of his church recently described him as a gentleman of the first order. He lived what he believed, a rare commodity. So he was very involved with his church, getting people elected to office, and so on. So later, he took part in a video I produced called God's Law and Society. I'll also post those clips. And we did a clip called World Changes Seminar, which actually we filmed on the Capitol Mall in Washington, D.C., which was kind of cool. So just in summary, one of the hallmarks of Jeff's preaching, he always threw his whole heart into preaching. He could be preaching to 20 people, and he would speak in this huge, forceful tone like a whipfield, and volume, like loud, And he could be preaching to a crowd of hundreds or a small group. It didn't matter. That's how he preached. It was kind of funny in a way, but that was Jeff. We also worked together on another publication called Statesman Global Initiatives website and blog. And Jeff's book, the last book he did, was called Republic Restored, was accepted into the Library of Congress. So the last couple of years of Jeff's life were very difficult. I'm very happy that he remained a friend of mine, that I stuck with him. And I just rejoice that he's joined the Church Triumphant.